All right, get ready because today we are going to take a deep dive into 19th century true crime.
Ooh, sounds interesting.
And you know how much our listeners love a good historical mystery?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Well, the case of Lydia Sherman,
The Darby poisoner.
yeah, the Derby poisoner, it's about as chilling as they come.
Absolutely.
So to guide our deep dive today, we've got excerpts from her Wikipedia page, a book titled Fatal, The Poisonous Life of a Female Serial Killer, and some really fascinating historical articles.
You know, what I find so fascinating about Lydia's case is it's not just about the murders themselves. It's like this window into the societal pressures and legal constraints that women faced back then.
Yeah, how much did her circumstances contribute to her actions?
Right,
It
exactly.
really makes you think.
It does.
So Lydia was born in 1824 and had a bit of a rough start, orphaned young and raised by her uncle.
Oh, wow.
And at 17, she married Edward Struck, and they settled in New York City.
Hmm. Seems like a pretty typical path for a woman in that era.
Yeah, it does, right?
Yeah.
But then things took a pretty dark turn.
You know, you have to remember that women in the 1800s had very limited options.
Yeah.
They were financially dependent on their husbands with little legal recourse or social mobility, you know?
Right, and that's important context to keep in mind.
It is vital, although it certainly does not excuse any crimes.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Because in 1864, Edward died seemingly of natural causes.
Okay.
But here's where it gets really interesting. He was just the first of 11 victims.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And it gets even more chilling because that same year, Lydia poisoned 3 of her children,
Oh my gosh.
followed by 2 more in 1865.
Wow.
And every single death certificate just listed typhoid fever.
Which was rampant back then.
Yes, very common illness.
So it was easy to kind of fly under the radar.
Exactly, exactly.
Wow, it's so clever, but it's also incredibly disturbing.
Yeah, very much so.
And to use arsenic, no less, which I understand was really readily available back then.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Arsenic was everywhere. And pesticides, medicines, even some cosmetics.
Wait, cosmetics?
Yeah.
Seriously.
Uh-huh.
That's terrifying.
It really is. If you think about it, it's unthinkable now.
Yeah.
But back then, this accessibility made it, well, a poisoner's dream.
Yeah.
And Lydia clearly knew how to use it.
Okay, so let's fast forward a bit.
Okay.
In 1868, she's a widow, and she remarries Dennis Hurlburt.
Oh, right.
Sadly, he dies soon after.
Oh, no.
Are you telling me this wasn't just a one-off?
Sadly, no, it wasn't.
Wow.
This time, though, Lydia was working as a nurse.
Okay.
So that would have given her easy access to arsenic and probably a good working knowledge of its effects.
Oh, that makes sense.
If we kind of connect this back to the bigger picture, we start to see a pattern emerging.
It's almost like she had this blueprint for getting away with murder, except for the marrying part.
Right.
Because in 1870, she marries Horatio Sherman. You can probably guess what happens next.
Let me guess.
He dies in 1871.
Of course.
It's almost comical in a dark way. You know?
It's a very tragic recurring theme. It really is.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's interesting to note that poisoning was often considered a feminine method of murder.
Feminine. I don't know if I follow that. What do you mean?
Okay, well, think about it. In the 19th century, women were largely confined to, you know, the domestic sphere.
Okay.
So poisoning compared to, let's say, stabbing or shooting was seen as less physically violent,
Yeah.
more subtle, more easily concealed, something that could be done within a woman's domain.
Right.
And it also kind of played into these societal perceptions of women as weak and incapable of brute force.
So by choosing poison, Lydia was unknowingly playing into these very stereotypes that kept women marginalized.
Exactly, precisely.
Now, it's tragically ironic.
It really is.
But thankfully, the truth eventually caught up with her.
It did.
And in 1872, suspicion finally fell on Lydia, leading to her arrest.
A woman poisoning 3 husbands.
Wow.
It was a national scandal splashed across every newspaper.
I can only imagine. So what happened at her trial? Did the court recognize any of these societal constraints that might have influenced her actions?
Unfortunately, not really.
Oh,
Lydia was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison.
okay.
It seemed like justice was served, but remember how we were talking about those limited options for women?
Yeah.
Well, that theme continues even in prison.
All right, now you've got my attention. What happened?
5 years into her sentence, Lydia, pretending to be ill, pulled off a daring escape from prison.
She escaped.
Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible. But how? And wouldn't people recognize her?
Well, you see, this escape actually tells us a lot about the lax security and societal attitudes towards female criminals back then.
Okay.
They simply didn't expect a woman to be capable of such cunning or think that she posed a serious threat.
So even in prison, those societal biases worked to her advantage.
At least for a little while, yeah.
It's crazy how these biases permeated every aspect of life back then.
It really is.
But I'm guessing they eventually recaptured her?
They did.
Okay.
It wasn't long before she was back behind bars, and this time there would be no escape.
Oh, wow.
Lydia died in prison from cancer in 1878.
What a story.
Yeah, it's a whirlwind.
But before we get too swept away by all the drama,
Right.
let's pause and think about what we've learned so far.
Absolutely, yeah, we've really just scratched the surface.
So we have this woman who poisoned 11 people,
Including her husbands and children.
including her husbands and children, wow, and used incredibly clever tactics to avoid detection.
And even managed a daring prison escape.
And all of this happened within this societal context that really limited women's choices and shaped perceptions in such profound ways.
Yeah, it's a chilling reminder that sometimes the most fascinating stories are also the most complex.
It really is.
It is.
It makes you wonder, was Lydia simply a cold-blooded killer, or was she in some way a product of her circumstances? What do you think?
That is the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And to really answer it, we need to delve a little deeper into the details of her crimes, her methods, and the societal reactions to her case.
Okay, I'm ready to go deeper. Where do we start?
Well, in the next part of our deep dive, we'll examine the chilling details of Lydia's weapon of choice, arsenic.
Okay.
It was a really readily available poison in the 19th century,
Oh, I bet.
but its effects were absolutely devastating.
Yeah.
We'll explore how Lydia used it to her advantage and how its accessibility actually played a role in her crimes.
All right, arsenic is. I'm ready to hear more about this deadly tool of the trade.
Great, because the story of the Derby poisoner is far from over.
I can't wait.
And the more we uncover, the more complicated and thought-provoking it becomes.
I bet it does.
It does.
All right, you mentioned arsenic.
Yeah,
Seems almost commonplace back then, like something out of an Agatha Christie novel.
right.
But to think people were just casually using this deadly substance, it's mind-boggling.
It really is. You know, in the 19th century, arsenic was everywhere. Pesticides, medicines, even cosmetics.
Cosmetics? Seriously?
Yeah,
That's terrifying. It's like playing Russian roulette with your beauty routine.
exactly. And, you know, this easy accessibility made arsenic a very popular tool for, well, poisoners.
Right.
And Lydia, as we know, was no exception.
Right.
But she wasn't just haphazardly sprinkling it around.
No.
No, she was very methodical. Our sources suggest she very carefully controlled the dosages and the time frames.
Really?
Yeah, to kind of mimic natural illnesses.
Hold on. Are we saying she had a deep understanding of how arsenic works? How is that even possible?
Well, remember, Lydia worked as a nurse.
Right, right.
So that meant she probably had access to medical text and knowledge of symptomatology.
Okay.
So she understood that arsenic poisoning, especially in small controlled doses, could very easily be mistaken for diseases like typhoid fever.
Which was rampant back then.
Exactly.
So she was basically weaponizing her medical knowledge.
You could say that, yeah.
It's cunning, but it's also chilling.
It's both. It really is.
Did any of the sources shed any light on exactly how she administered the poison?
Actually, yeah, Lydia's alleged confession
Oh.
that was published in a Hartford Courant back in 1873 provides some insights, although of course we have to take it with a grain of salt.
Of course.
But in it, she describes Lee gradually increasing the dosage over time to mimic the slow, agonizing progression of typhoid fever.
That's cold-blooded.
It is, but it also speaks to a certain level of intelligence and planning. You know, she wasn't just lashing out. She had a strategy.
Right.
She understood the effects of arsenic, and she was manipulating that knowledge to achieve her desired outcome.
It's a disturbing thought.
It is a disturbing thought.
But I guess it does force us to acknowledge that duality of intelligence, it could be used for good or for evil.
Absolutely.
It's a sobering thought, for sure, and it kind of makes her escape from prison even more impressive.
Right.
Didn't she feign illness to pull that off?
She did. She basically convinced the prison staff that she was too ill to be transported for medical treatment.
Wow.
And then, under the cover of darkness, she just walked out the door.
That's a bold move.
It was a bold move, and it worked.
And she even got a job as a housekeeper, blending back into society.
Yeah.
Did anyone suspect anything?
Well, you know, this escape actually highlights the prevailing attitudes towards female criminals back then.
Okay.
They were just underestimated, seen as incapable of such cunning or posing a serious threat.
Right.
So this kind of societal blindness, in a way, enabled Lydia to evade capture.
At least temporarily.
At least temporarily, yeah.
So even within the prison system, those gender biases were at play.
Yeah, they were everywhere.
It's a chilling reminder that these societal norms can have such far-reaching consequences.
They really can.
But you mentioned earlier that poisoning was often seen as a feminine method of murder.
Yeah.
I'm curious, how does Lydia's case compare to other female poisoners throughout history?
That's a great question. One of the most infamous cases is that of Mary Ann Cotton.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of her.
She was a British serial killer
Right.
who, just like Lydia, used arsenic to poison multiple husbands and children.
Wow.
This was in the mid-1800s. And, both of these women operated within a very similar societal context where their roles were really limited and their actions often went unnoticed or dismissed.
So are we seeing a pattern here? Women trapped by societal constraints turning to poison as this silent, almost invisible weapon.
It's a pattern that criminologists and historians have observed in numerous cases.
Wow.
Poisoning, with its subtle nature and association with domesticity, became a tool that some women who were desperate and trapped used to exert a level of control that they just couldn't otherwise achieve.
Right. Okay, I see the connection.
Yeah.
But I'm still grappling with that big question. Was Lydia purely a cold-blooded killer, or was she in some way a product of her circumstances?
It's a complex question with no easy answer.
For sure.
But I think to really try to understand Lydia, we have to consider the world that she lived in.
Okay.
Limited opportunities, financial dependence on men, immense pressure to conform.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
But 11 victims, including her own children, that's a lot to reconcile with, even considering the societal constraints.
You're right.
Is that truly justifiable?
It's a difficult concept to grasp, but perhaps by examining her alleged confession,
Okay.
we can gain some insight into her state of mind at the time.
Okay.
Remember, she claimed that her first husband, Edward, he became really depressed and abusive after losing his job.
So she felt trapped and desperate and saw poisoning as the only way out.
It's possible. We have to remember that this is just one side of the story.
Right.
But her confession, regardless of its veracity, does kind of offer a glimpse into that desperation that may have fueled her actions.
It adds another layer to the story for sure, but it also reminds us that we can never truly know what goes on in someone's mind, especially someone who lived in a time so different from our own.
Exactly. We can analyze the facts, we can explore the context, and we can try to understand the motivations, but ultimately, some mysteries will always remain unsolved.
Right.
And maybe that's part of what makes exploring these historical cases so compelling. They challenge us to think critically, to question our assumptions, and to really try to recognize the complexities of human behavior.
Well said. It's easy to get caught up in the sensational aspects of these stories.
Right.
But we shouldn't lose sight of the human cost here. 11 lives were lost, including innocent children.
Absolutely.
That's a tragedy that should never be overshadowed by the intrigue surrounding Lydia herself.
You're absolutely right. It's a crucial point to remember, and as we delve deeper into the aftermath of Lydia's crimes, it's essential to keep that perspective in mind.
Aftermath. Okay, now you've got me really curious. What kind of aftermath are we talking about?
Well, in the next part of our deep dive, we'll shift our focus to the public reaction to Lydia's case, the media frenzy that surrounded her trial, and the lasting impact her story had on the community.
Okay.
We'll explore how her crimes really sparked discussions about gender roles, societal inequalities, and even led to some legal reforms.
Wow, so her story had a ripple effect far beyond her own life.
It certainly did, and as we'll see, the story of the Derby poisoner isn't just about one woman's crimes. It's a reflection of a society grappling with change, confronting uncomfortable truths, and ultimately striving for a more just future.
Okay, so we've gone through the chilling details of Lydia's crimes and explored the societal pressures of her time.
Yeah,
And I think we've tried to wrap our heads around her motivation.
as best we can.
But you mentioned this ripple effect, this lasting impact on society.
Right.
What exactly happened after the dust settled?
Well, you have to imagine the shockwaves. This wasn't just some local whisper. This was a national scandal.
Wow.
The Derby poisoner, a woman who poisoned her way through 3 husbands and 8 children.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Headlines were screaming across the country.
A true media frenzy.
Oh, for sure.
It's the kind of story that just would have gripped everyone's attention.
Absolutely.
So did public opinion fall on one side or the other?
It was really sharply divided.
Okay.
For some, Lydia was just a monster.
Right.
A woman who defied every societal norm and committed unspeakable acts.
Yeah?
She became a cautionary tale, really reinforcing the belief that women were inherently deceitful and capable of unimaginable cruelty.
But given the limited options women had back then, didn't anyone sympathize with her situation?
Oh, absolutely. There was another segment of society that saw her as a victim of circumstance.
Okay.
A woman who was driven to these desperate measures by a system that offered her very few alternatives.
Right.
And they argued that her crimes, while horrific, were a consequence of the very structures that kept women trapped and powerless.
So Lydia's case, in a way, became this lightning rod for broader discussions about gender roles and societal inequalities.
Exactly, precisely.
It's pretty amazing that a serial killer's case could spark conversations about social justice.
It's pretty fascinating.
Did anything actually tangible come out of these debates?
It wasn't an immediate shift, but the years following Lydia's conviction saw this growing movement for legal reforms. And people began really pushing for laws that granted women greater autonomy, financial independence, and protection from those abusive situations.
So Lydia's tragic story, in a way, paved the way for progress.
It's a strange kind of silver lining to such a dark cloud, isn't it?
Yeah, it really
Mm.
is. It makes you think how even the darkest chapters of history can lead to some unexpected progress.
Yeah.
It's like this stark reminder that change often arises from discomfort, from confronting the unsettling realities that we might prefer to ignore.
Couldn't put it better myself.
Faith.
And, it's this complexity, this ability to spark both horror and introspection that makes exploring these historical cases so valuable.
Yeah, we've gone from like the very specific details of arsenic poisoning to a broader discussion of gender roles and legal reforms.
Yeah.
It's incredible how one woman's story can really encompass so much.
It really highlights that interconnectedness of history.
Yeah.
How seemingly isolated events are often really intertwined with these larger social, cultural, and political forces.
Right.
And it reminds us that the past is never truly past. It continues to shape our present in ways that we may not even realize.
So true.
It really is.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm just struck by the enduring power of Lydia's story.
Yeah.
It's a chilling tale of crime and punishment, but it's also this reflection of a society struggling to define its values.
And grappling with the consequences of its own biases.
Right. Well said. I think our listeners will walk away from this deep dive with a lot to think about.
I hope so.
A renewed curiosity for history, and maybe even a slightly different perspective on the world around them.
I certainly hope so. After all, exploring the past isn't just about uncovering facts. It's about understanding ourselves.
Our present.
And the possibilities for a more just and equitable future.
And on that note, I think it's time to close the book on the Derby poisoner.
Yeah.
A woman whose life and crimes continue to fascinate and challenge us over a century later.
Until next time, keep those minds curious. And remember, history is a conversation.
Yes.
And it's up to all of us to participate.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.